This is The Weekly on ClickOrlando.com with Justin Warmoth.
Good morning, I'm Justin Warmoth. Even with inflation reaching its highest point in some 40 years, it seems the one thing upsetting folks the most, prices at the pump. While gas prices typically dip in the first few months of the year, this year has certainly been different, with prices reaching their highest level in nearly 8 years. This morning, Patrick DeHaan, an analyst with GasBuddy, is here to break down what's behind the spike and whether reaching $4 a gallon is a real possibility. For people who are unaware of what GasBuddy is, what services GasBuddy provides, can you give us a little overview?
Well, GasBuddy is basically an app, a service that helps motorists find their perfect pit stop with not only finding the lowest price gas. If you want to find that high price station and fill up there, you can find that as well. But we also have ratings and reviews, so you know where you want to stop on the road. And you can find just about anything. We also have a payments card that links with a checking account that can save users up to 25 cents a gallon with what we call deal alerts. So basically, any way to save at the pump, to find those low prices. And if you're not all about that, maybe just to find a clean restroom on a road trip.
Oh, great. Great services there. All right. So, there are a lot of myths on what spikes gas prices, what brings them down. And I'd like to debunk some of those. What's the most common, you think, myth that average folks get wrong when it comes to gas prices?
Well, I think nowadays in the politically charged climate that a president has some sort of influence over the price of a global commodity. Whether you lean right or left, there's a lot of finger pointing. Now, politicians have wanted to take credit for low prices. They finger point when there's high prices. But all in all, that's probably one of my favorite myths is that these politicians who generally don't necessarily have a firm grasp on economics like to say, I'm the one you can thank for gas prices when it's really a function of global supply and demand.
And as folks should be aware by now, there's quite a bit going on globally. That has to factor in, obviously it is factoring into what we're seeing currently at the pump and the prices there. The Ukraine and Russia feud right now, is that what's driving currently the prices at the pump and the price of oil on a global scale, or what other factors are at play?
I mean, that's certainly one of the factors in the driver's seat right now is what's going on, the concern that Russia would invade Ukraine. And the backdrop to the context is that back in October, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a Russian natural gas pipeline, was completed, and Germany had to approve it before it could go into service. They kind of dragged their feet over that. And so the Russians kind of penalized them or punished them by curtailing natural gas shipments to Europe. And of course, natural gas prices skyrocketed then across much of Europe. There were concerns that there'd be shortages. And so Russia essentially weaponized natural gas to get what they wanted. Now, the thinking is that if the U.S., well, first of all, let me back up. If the Russians do invade Ukraine, the U.S. is almost certainly going to issue sanctions, which have been promised by President Biden. The Russians could respond by curtailing oil exports because they're the second largest oil producer globally. So if they did that, the price of oil would suddenly spike. Of course, we're in the midst of economic recovery, a lot of imbalances because of COVID. And so demand has recovered globally for crude oil much faster than supply. So right now, that Russian oil is really key to keeping prices in check. I mean, everyone's oil, right? Doesn't matter if it's the Russians or Americans. Market is demanding a lot of oil. And so that's the concern that's driving up oil prices, that if Russia does invade Ukraine, potentially there could be some collateral damage to oil production.
And it seems that when oil prices go up, prices at the pump are almost immediately going up as well. However, when prices of oil drop, it takes seemingly a lot longer for prices at the pump to go down at the same time. Is there a reason behind that?
Well, yeah, the rock and feather approach. Generally speaking, there are increases when the price of oil goes up. The price of gasoline, the wholesale price, follows that same day. Now, a lot of the time when I'm looking at that and watching how prices move, there is a delay. Motorists may not realize it. It does seem fast, but usually gas stations struggle to be able to raise their price to reflect the actual cost for probably 2 to 4 days. The bigger the spike, the faster stations can pass it along because all the stations are generally in the same boat, right? They need to raise prices But often with smaller price increases, some stations may not match that increase. So other stations will have to go back down. And it takes them a few tries to successfully raise their price. 2 to 4 days of selling gasoline at or below cost hurts them enough. And yes, when prices then come back down, stations lower their price slower than the decrease that actually occurred to make up for the loss when prices went up. So it all evens out. And instead of seeing stations all over town, widely different, 30 cents different, because by the way, the price of gasoline does change on a daily basis for what stations are paying. They all kind of meet each other in the middle and it works out. And unfortunately, it does take time for prices to come down because stations are keen to make back that lost profit.
In your projections, as you look ahead, as you forecast, are you expecting prices to go even higher? Are we going to flirt with $4 a gallon in your eyes?
I think nationally that's a number we could get to. We're only 50 cents a gallon away from that today. The national average is closing in on 3.50. My concern is that this is the time of year that we generally see among the lowest prices for the year because low demand. The problem is that just in a couple of weeks here, starting really in early March, gasoline demand starts going back up because temperatures warm up. Americans want to get out. We also switch back, a transition back to summer gasoline. It's a phase that takes a couple of months. And then refineries also do maintenance work in the late winter, early spring. And all of that culminates in gas prices that on average go up from 25 to 75 cents a gallon between late February and Memorial Day weekend. So not even factoring in the geopolitical tensions, we're kind of on this road that could bring us near to $4. If Russia invades Ukraine, I think certainly we'll get there. I think there's a very high likelihood. The only question is kind of one that's come out of left field. The US and other world superpowers have been talking to Iran about a nuclear deal. Now, that's been elusive for months. That is, Iran is off on some other book, and the US and world powers are trying to get them into an agreement. It hasn't happened for months, but now there's rekindled interest because Iran holds a sizable sum of oil that it could sell. And essentially, the US could be interested in keeping oil prices down. So the number one way to do that, make a deal with Iran. Their oil has been sanctioned for 3 to 4 years. They have millions of barrels floating at sea. So that's kind of one of those things that could be used to bring down the price of oil. But it's really the only lever that the president and Western countries have.
There's also talk about just a gas tax, suspending the federal gas tax. I mean, is that something that would be significant as far as just average motorists and seeing that in their wallet and having that extra cash? Is that going to make that much of a difference?
Well, to me, if I see a 5% off coupon, it's like big whoop. That's essentially what that 18.4 cent gallon discount would be that the Democrats are talking about. When we're paying about $3.50, it amounts to about a 5% discount. And that's just, whether it's for pizza or flowers, 5% discount doesn't really, do much for me. It's still a high price of gasoline. Is it something? Yes. Is it temporary while they're talking about only doing it for a year? So it's very limited relief. And now keep in mind, the other side of that is that money goes to the Highway Infrastructure Fund. Collectively, that is going to cost the U.S. some $25 billion that won't go to crumbling infrastructure. So as a motorist who has to deal with bumpy roads, potholes, and bridges that are in decrepit condition, is that a great idea? I'd rather pay the 18.4 cents and have my roads be a little bit better.
We'll have more with GasBuddy's Patrick DeHaan after this, including the long-term impacts of prices with electric vehicles becoming more popular. Stay with us.
This is The Weekly on ClickOrlando.com with Justin Warmoth.
Welcome back. Something impacting almost everyone's wallet right now, the price of gas. There are a number of factors at play as prices reach their highest level in nearly a decade, some of which could continue to drive up the cost. Patrick DeHaan, an analyst with GasBuddy, is back with us now with more insight on the pain at the pump.
At this point, $90 a barrel, right? That's the price of crude.
Yeah, we're right about 90
right
bucks.
About 90. Do you expect it to go to 120? That would be historic. That'd be a record. Some analysts projecting that.
Well, and that would be close to a record. Well, we only briefly touched beyond that for a period of a couple of days back in 2008. We did hit about 147. And by the way, inflation adjusted now, that would be at 222. I don't think we're going to get anywhere near that But in a worst case scenario, we're starting to get into a bit of a bubble. If all of this bad happens, if Russia invades Ukraine, if there's no nuclear deal with Iran, and if something else happens this spring, we could see $120, $130 barrel oil for a short period of time. The only good news to that is that high oil prices then incentivize oil producers to raise production. So the higher oil prices go, the quicker that production could be restored, and eventually the quicker we get back to normal prices. And that's very much how it works. I mean, look at 2011, 12, and 13. You remember when oil was every day over $100 a barrel? Look what that ushered in. Back in 2015, 16, 17, gas prices were only around $2 a gallon. And so high oil prices then eventually lead to lower prices. And that could be the situation here. We're just going to have to wait for it, be patient, and we're going to have to pay a little bit more, dig deeper this summer.
I want to go back to 2020, March, April, May, peak of shutdowns, peak of people staying at home. And you had a lot of oil sitting in tankers with nowhere to go. Take me back to that time and what was going through your head as that unprecedented situation occurred?
Yeah, truly unprecedented. We've never in history seen such an abrupt shift in consumer behavior. The nation went from consuming over 9 million barrels of gasoline a day to basically having that overnight. We went down to about 5 to 6 million barrels. The economy was broadly shut down as a result of Americans' drastic shift in behavior not to go out and drive around or, driving to work and whatnot. Demand for gasoline plummeted, which then caused prices to plummet because suddenly that gasoline is no longer liquid gold. Mm-hmm. So as you indicate, then very quickly, the factory, so to speak, oil producers were still churning out the same amount of oil from pre-pandemic. And very quickly a glut formed because we just consumed so much less of it almost in an instant. And so a glut formed over, the following months. And then very quickly, oil producers, including those in the U.S., especially when they faced, those $20, $10 barrel prices. Now, keep in mind, even for a couple of hours, they went negative, but that didn't last very long. Oil companies had no choice, but nobody was using their product, oil, and the price was negligible. It was almost nil. So oil companies basically shut down shop. OPEC, which is a cartel of about a little over a dozen oil producing countries, did the same. They cut an astonishing 10 million barrels a day of oil production. That's basically just a little bit less than what the U.S. is producing today. So the equivalent of the world's largest oil producer shut down. And then as we started to slowly recover in the summer of 2020, remember, everyone got outside. We just didn't do things inside. Gasoline demand started to rebound. And very quickly, because oil producers went completely, to shut down, we started eroding that glut of oil. And very quickly, we essentially soaked it up. It was like a sponge. Mm-hmm. Americans started to return. And then vaccines allowed a big turning point as well. The economy broadly reopened. And with a whole lot less oil being produced, again, that glut was very quick to get sucked down by Americans filling their tanks. So we're back at a point now where oil inventories are consistently well below the 5-year average. So we went from glut to not enough very quickly.
And I think that's the sticker shock essentially, is that, hey, remember when it was $2 a gallon in 2020? Why is it $3.50 now? Why is it going to go towards $4 a gallon? I just don't understand how it can do that with just a change in administration. And essentially, that's such an important point that I do want to reiterate has very little to do with who's in the White House.
Absolutely. We would have seen gas prices surge under a Republican just the same because presidents aren't controlling this. This is global supply and demand. And keep in mind, because global oil is such a mainstay across countries, it's not just the U.S. So all of a sudden you went from very little oil production, hardly any planes were flying. You remember how many planes were grounded? All those pictures of American Airlines, United, that happened across the globe. Hardly any planes were in the sky because we didn't know anything. Trains were stopped. People weren't buying anything because people were getting laid off. So essentially everything shut down for a period of 2 to 3 months. And then very quickly, once vaccines, fast forward to kind of late 2020, we started to get some of those efficacy numbers from those vaccines. the market started to rally. Oil prices started to go back up because vaccines were going to allow that to happen, essentially to slow this whole thing down. And very quickly, prices started to surge because Americans started to feel more confident with vaccines. They felt like they could get out. And so demand surged. And not just in this country, but globally as well. Everyone kind of was in the same boat. And so it wouldn't have mattered a Republican or Democrat. We're still going to see a massive increase in global demand at a time that supply was drastically lower because the pandemic. Keep in mind, early in the pandemic, President Trump begged essentially Russia and Saudi Arabia to cut oil production. That was a needed move. The more quickly you could stem the decline in the price of oil, the faster oil companies could recover without losses. And that was a smart thing to do. But keep in mind, if you want to blame President Biden, keep in mind that it was President Trump that actually begged other countries to cut oil production in order to rebound more quickly. And that's exactly what's happened. If oil companies hadn't have cut back, we would have had this longer glut and more people probably laid off at oil companies, and it would have been a longer recovery.
You know, while I have you here, I'm curious your take on gas prices as this push for electric vehicles really ramps up, and there's a lot of projections by 2030, 2040, a lot of vehicles will be electric, and how that would factor in to gas prices and vehicles that are still powered by gas. I mean, what do you project? What do you forecast through as the push for electric vehicles continues?
Well, I think the push has been harder, certainly under the Biden administration, and certainly the Biden administration has been less friendly to the oil sector while we're speaking of that. So I'll say it this way, that EVs certainly are going to find a mainstay in large U.S. cities, but they're not going to be the answer out in the middle of the country where there's no infrastructure and where infrastructure would be so costly. I don't think in my lifetime we're going to rid the planet of internal combustion engines. I think there's absolutely a place where in big cities you have EVs that are far more efficient when you're sitting in traffic, that aren't burning gasoline, but out in the country it doesn't work. So, you know, a lot of Americans may make that jump to EV, but certainly I think alternative energies, whether it's hydrogen or gasoline, there's going to be a use for liquid fuels. You know, you can't just set a power plant in the middle of Wyoming for a couple of EVs. So they all have their advantages. Eventually, the decline in gasoline demand will start to lower price. But at the same time, and this is where politics do come into play, the president is essentially pushing the EV sector forward. And at the same time, kind of pushing back against oil. So the concern is that if this transition isn't handled perfectly, you know, there's going to be a lot of bumps in the road, not only for EVs and the infrastructure, but for gasoline as investors ditch some of those companies because they see the writings on the wall. And that's the concern, is that if this transition isn't handled perfectly, we're going to have a lot of bumps. Gas prices could surge if basically the industry is forced to shut down before the transition happens. And I think that's my concern, is that there's a lot of unknowns. I think a lot of people in the next 5 to 10 years will make a switch to EVs, especially with higher prices. But will there be the infrastructure? You know, a lot of questions unknown still.
And my thanks to Patrick DeHaan with GasBuddy for the time this week. As always, we have the latest information coming out of Ukraine and how it's affecting gas prices on our website, clickorlando.com. I'm Justin Warmoth. Hope you have a great Sunday.